send people into the Tea Party movement who are real wackos or pretend to be real wackos. Or if there are real wackos out there, they make sure that they're brought in to the Tea Party movement. And every time there's a media crew going out there with their cameras taking pictures, do they take pictures of the you know, the 10,000 middle-class Americans who know what they're talking about? Or do they pick the 2 or 3 wackos over here with the tinfoil hats? Or the guys with the swastikas on their arm and so forth? That's where they focus, you see. And I believe that some of those people are probably sent in there on purpose, just to demonize and discredit the movement. Now, this is hard for most Americans to believe, because they don't realize that this is really hardball. This political game is hardball, and they don't realize that it is a game and that there are professionals playing it. It's a matter of historical record that the group of people that sometimes we call capitalists, the big, super wealthy families, you know, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and the heads of the big corporations in America, AT&T, Ford Motor Company, and so forth. People think of them as the super capitalists. It's a historical fact that many of these people have provided the funding, the essential funding, to help bring to power regimes such as Hitler's regime that was well funded by American financiers and British, and also in communist Russia, the group there, the Leninist group, was well funded by American and London bankers. And so it's tempting to say, well, they created their own opposition. And I think that's partially true, but I wouldn't go that far. I think what these people do is they look around and they see what kind of native opposition is out there, and or what kind of native groups are growing, movements are growing, that they really want to control. Maybe they don't necessarily create them, but they see which ones are coming to the front, and those are the ones they move into. And if you have enough money, you know, millions and millions of dollars, it's not too difficult to gain influence over almost any new group that's struggling against its opposition and looking for money. So they've played this game. They played it in both the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany. I think they're doing the same thing in America. I think that's one of the things going on now with the Tea Party movement. I don't think they created it at all, but they see it as something that has the potential of being a powerful movement, and so they are putting their best attention and a lot of money into it to see if they can't capture it for their own uses. Another tactic, isn't it, that the opposition knows that the American people, any people in the world, will gladly give up their liberty and their comforts if it's in their mind a means of gaining security, protection against a dreaded threat of some kind. That's why regimes that are struggling to hold the loyalty of their people are very dangerous regimes, because instinctively they know they have to go to war. They know that in time of war, the people will rally behind their leaders no matter what, because we're at war. And if we lose this war, we'll be invaded, we'll be conquered by some dreaded enemy. And so throughout history, governments that are weak or losing influence over their own people traditionally start wars, or they manufacture false flag operations against themselves. They create their own enemies. They want to be victims so that they can rally their citizens behind them, and anybody who wants to continue criticizing these leaders is then branded as being unpatriotic, or possibly even branded as a traitor. So it's an old ploy. It's been done throughout history. Machiavelli wrote about it. It's everywhere you look in history, you see this ploy being used. And is it being used today in America? Absolutely it is, I'm sorry to say. It's interesting to me how organizations as innocuous sounding as a tax-exempt foundation can have such tremendous clout in determining the nation's politics and its foreign policy and its economic policy. It turns out that organizations, these big ones like the Rockefeller Funds and the Ford Foundation and these big tax-exempt megaliths, the general impression of them is that they do good works. I mean, they're supposedly doing charity of some kind or educational projects. But boy, what a difference there is between that image and the reality when you look at some of them. They spend a great deal, if not most of their money, promoting certain projects, which, although they can be described as philanthropic, are really very, very political in nature. The Ford Foundation in particular, it comes to mind because although they spend millions and hundreds of millions of dollars supposedly to improve the social condition and the economic condition of minority groups, when you see where the money goes, it goes almost always to very radical minority groups. They're not even minority groups anymore. They're radical political change groups, the ones that are trying to bring about very destructive movements inside the United States. All of the radical Latino movements, and I'm not just talking about Latino, I'm talking about radical movements, like overthrow the United States, that kind of a movement, like cut off Texas and return it to Mexico. That's the kind of movement I'm talking about. And they're all funded by the Ford Foundation, all tax-exempt money. And this has been going on for decades. And you come eventually to the conclusion that the directors of the Ford Foundation know exactly what they're doing. They're not making a mistake and continuing to make the same mistake for decades. They know exactly what they're doing. And what they're trying to do is to divide America. They're trying to weaken America. They're trying to bring America down so she is no longer a powerful force in the world, so that she's reeling and she's kneeling and she can be comfortably merged with all the other nations of the world, and she'll be willing to give up her culture, her freedoms, her judicial system, economic system, in gratitude in order to be saved from some kind of internal chaos and revolution and being starved and so forth, starvation. And in other words, these people are deliberately trying to weaken America. So all of this is being done, not all of it, most of it is being done under the aegis of tax-exempt foundations. What a beautiful cover, but this has been going on for a long time. There certainly has been a change in the function of the American government. In the beginning, it was set up with a definite system of checks and balances, and the executive and judicial and legislative branch were supposed to be fairly equal so they could check each other. There's been a change, gradual change over the years, starting primarily with World War I. When there was this great crisis, we had to defend ourselves against foreign enemies. And ever since then, one crisis after another has added to the impetus for us to change our form of government, supposedly to make us more secure. So we've given up that checks and balances concept. Gradually, it's been reinforced by Supreme Court decisions, it's been reinforced by new legislation, and it's been reinforced by the media, and primarily reinforced by the apathy of the American people, if not their total ignorance of the way it should be, because they don't teach this in school anymore. So it's happened. No matter how it's happened or who's responsible, it has happened, so that now we do not have checks and balances between three forms or three branches of government. A realistic appraisal is that we have a dictatorship. It's a democratic dictatorship. And most of the power resides in the hands of the President of the United States. Originally, the President was supposed to be like the President of any corporation. He took orders from the Board of Directors. And he didn't determine policy, major policy at least, maybe minor policy, but the major decisions were made by the Board of Directors. And his job was merely to implement those policies. That's the way it used to be in America. The president was a relatively unimportant person. He was selected by the states, and he was to implement policies of the Congress. Today, that's not the case. Today, the president is basically the same as a king. We don't call him a king. We don't say Your Highness. We say Mr. President. But he has almost unlimited powers, the same as any great ruler of history. And Congress, although we still think of it as being an important body, pretty much steps back and lets the president do whatever he wants to do. Congress theoretically has the power of the purse because they can vote the money to fund the projects of the president. But even that has been circumvented because now the president has worked, and not just the current president, but this whole process has worked out ways and means by which, in partnership with the Federal Reserve System, they can create funding without Congress. So now the president has special funds for this and special funds for that and secret funds for this. The president can, with a stroke of a pen, just create all kinds of money without Congress even having any say-so in it at all. So we come to the sad conclusion that the United States is no longer the country it was. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? The old methods of writing a letter to your congressman don't work anymore. It's time for a fundamental change. And that's not going to happen, though, until more and more Americans, first of all, wake up to the reality of their present plight. That we're still living in a dream world, still reading in our history books, looking at pictures of George Washington and his white socks and so forth, and the signing of the Declaration, and we think it's still that way. It's not that way, folks. And so people live in this dream world. The first step is to realize what we're really living under, what kind of a system we're really living under, and then to go back and figure out what kind of a system do we want to restore. And I think restoring the concepts in our original Constitution is a great step forward, not backward, but forward. We've been going backwards toward monarchy ever since World War I. We have to go forward now to the past, if I can coin that phrase. But that's not going to happen until a large number of Americans understand that it has to happen. So that's, what is that, an optimistic or a pessimistic view? I think it's an optimistic view in the long run. It's a pessimistic view in the short run because nothing like that is going to happen by November. It's not going to happen in the next election. Americans are always focused on, well, how can we make this happen quickly so I can go back to my golf game? I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. If I'll become active maybe for a few months and I'll vote for a candidate or something, but don't drag this thing out, please, because I'm too busy. They want to know how we can turn this all around by the next election. It can't be done by the next election, but it can be done. That's the optimistic part. I think if we have a realistic view of the political process, and we know that it takes sometimes a generation or two for really important changes to happen. And if we understand that and accept it, and accept our role in being responsible for making it happen, then you can go to sleep at night and say, by golly, I'm really doing something about this, and I am making a difference, and it will happen. I don't know when the administrative branches of government became totally dominant. All I know is that it was a little bit at a time. And it sort of like a jerky motion. Every time there's a crisis, every time there's a war, every time there's a terrorist attack, or if there's a banking crisis, no matter what the crisis is, this movement toward totalitarianism accelerates. And then it slows down until the next crisis comes along. And I don't know if I could say at what point that happened, but I can say that it did happen, and it's even continuing today. Yes, I did see the clip in which Hillary Clinton says that, I think she was saying it was nice to be so close to the headquarters of the Council on Foreign Relations because she didn't have to go very far to find out what to think and how to act on certain issues, or something to that effect. And I'm sure she's been embarrassed by that statement and probably has issued some kind of a qualifying statement that, well, she didn't mean it quite that way. But the fact of the matter is, I think she did mean it. Most people know in politics, they know that the Council on Foreign Relations is the center of all of this, that's where the power is. And you just don't get the green light to move up in politics unless the switch is thrown in the building there at the Council on Foreign Relations office. That's why all of the major candidates for office appear at the CFR conferences, and you can see video clips of them on the internet now and then. They're giving speeches, sometimes before large audiences and sometimes before small groups. But it's clear to me that they're brought in and they're